Okay, so we have been studying the formation of the United States, and we traced it through many different events, starting kind of back with the British ruling the colonies. And so we even took it one step further and talked about John Locke. And remember, when I tell you John Locke, you think of the Enlightenment. For the United States, John Locke and the Enlightenment are sort of the foundation of justifying the revolution. So remember, John Locke had three unalienable rights he talked about in his social contract theory. Remember, they were life, liberty, ownership of property. And remember, he says, if a government does not protect those rights, it's the citizen's responsibility to overthrow the government. They have the ability to overthrow the government because every government should guarantee those three rights. And remember, we talked about some particular acts that were passed against the United States. Specifically, we'll focus on the Quartering Act. It forced colonists to house and supply British soldiers. That one there sort of violates their ownership of property or their security of property. The Proclamation of 1763, that was an order that prohibited the American colonists from settling west of the Appalachian Mountains. And sort of a big deal because there was a lot of wealth that could be had out there, a lot of land to settle and farm and let people start lives and work towards making money. And they passed the Proclamation of 1763 as a measure to keep, I guess, the Indians happy or the Native Americans happy so that they wouldn't rebel and it wouldn't cause another expensive war for the British. Then the Townshend Acts were passed. They were acts that were passed to raise money to pay for British governors' salaries and other colonial officials. And these Townshend Acts suspended the New York Assembly because they refused to house or quarter soldiers and placed import taxes on goods like tea. The colonists were upset about this because it made their tea more expensive. It hurt their business. Every good that came into the colony was being taxed, and in turn, it was getting more and more expensive. And then finally, the Intolerable Acts. These were a series of laws passed by Parliament in 1774 to punish Massachusetts colonists for the Boston Tea Party. They were mad that the colonists had dumped tons and tons of tea, and it was very expensive, so they wanted the colonists to have to pay them back for it. So these series of acts were being passed by the British government, by Parliament, against the colonists in the New World. The colonists were ticked off because they felt that as British citizens, they had the right to be represented in Parliament. They felt that they were British citizens, not British subjects, and that they should have representation in Parliament. They said that these acts violated their rights since they had no representation in Parliament. Since taxes were passed without their consent, they did not believe that they had security of property or liberty. They came up with this slogan to sort of justify or to rally around. It was taxation without representation. And again, it says that they did not have representatives to vote on the laws that were passed against them in Parliament. So they were being taxed unfairly. They didn't give their permission to the government to tax them. So, all this anger, the colonists create a Declaration of Independence. They were sick and tired of being forced to live under an oppressive king or a monarch who was too powerful. So again, they declared independence. So to sum it up, this would go along with question number 7 on your study guide. The French and Indian War was costly to the British. They tried to lessen the financial burden or the burden that they had on themselves by having the colonists house and supply troops. And they taxed the colonists to raise money to help pay for their war debt. And again, those were the Quartering Act, Townshend Act, Intolerable Acts, so on and so forth. As well as keep the Indians from revolting and causing an expensive war. That was the Proclamation of 1763. Since they didn't allow the colonists to settle west of the Appalachians, the colonists did not like these laws, and they disregarded them. Britain pushed back. The more the colonists fought, the more Britain fought back. They passed even more laws. And again, it's sort of, we don't like you, so we're going to make more taxes for you. The Intolerable Acts were passed. It's kind of the last straw for the colonists. They were upset because they did not have representation in Parliament. And the passing of these laws, they felt that it violated their natural rights because they were not secure in their property. And don't forget about groups like the Sons of Liberty, who organized protests, who organized the Tea Party, organized some boycotts and tried to hit Britain where it hurt them, and that was economically. And these colonists kind of saw the writing on the wall. They'd gotten fed up. They started to stockpile weapons. Remember the battles of Lexington and Concord, and when the British marched on to seize those stockpiles of weapons, sort of begins the start of the Revolutionary War. And so fast forward, the colonists win the war, and they have some new social, political, economic relationships. There was one in particular we talked about, and that was separation of church and state. These people came over here. The colonists originally came over so that they could have freedom of religion. That's where your pilgrims are. They just want to be able to worship as they please. Well, each colony is now its own or separate independent state. They govern themselves. They are responsible for making their own laws. So we talked about in class a few things. For example, North Carolina stated that a person had to be Protestant to hold office. They had to be Protestant to hold office. That could fall on your political or your religious argument, but since it's making someone be Protestant to hold office, we'll consider it a church and state issue. Massachusetts said that a person could worship God as they please, as long as they did not disturb the public, and they also said that you must be Christian to hold office. So worship as you please, but you got to be at least some sort of Christian to hold office. New York said no religious priest can hold office. It's almost a complete separation of church and state. Again, and there was another one, or the arguments about taxpayer money going to the church. So Massachusetts said that tax money can go to the church of a taxpayer's choice. And Virginia completely split all ties between church and state. Now our political one, who can vote and hold office? In Pennsylvania, it was an adult male who paid taxes. And don't forget, they got rid of a governor and had a unicameral legislature. Unicameral, one house. There was only one house that made the laws. And again, they completely got rid of the governor. And don't forget, they got rid of the governor because they felt like he was a small-scale king. Okay? South Carolina. They said a white man with a significant amount of property could vote. Then they take it a step further. A white man with even more property had to have a ton of property to be able to run for office. And we had a stat in our reading. 90% of the people in South Carolina could not run for office. When you have a rule like that, it sort of leads to the rich becoming or being able to dominate. And that was the Southern gentry, the gentry class, the rich people, large landowners, large plantation owners, ended up being the ones that held the political offices. They were the ones who started making the laws, and it led to an unfair balance of power where the rich seemed to have the power. Moving on, talked about some economic relationships, and some of these tie in with our weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation. So the three weaknesses, economic problems we focused on after the Revolution were regulating currency, interstate commerce, and foreign trade. The currency one, inflation was high. Mercantilism had ended, and each state printed its own money. Some states printed a lot, and inflation was high, while other states printed very, very little, and there was not enough money to go around. Interstate commerce. Remember, that's trade between states, between between, like, say, Maryland and Virginia. Trade slowed because of a lack of a common currency. Each state taxed each other, causing high-priced goods. So if you were taking your goods from Georgia up to, we could say, Virginia to sell, it would get taxed along the way. And by the time the good got there, it was very expensive. People didn't want to buy these expensive goods. They couldn't afford them. So it caused a lot of problems. Finally, foreign trade. Foreign countries did not want to do business with the United States because the government did not have the power to enforce trade agreements. Remember, each state is separate and independent. So they didn't want to try to mess with the United States because there's no telling if France wants to trade with Georgia, but Virginia wants to trade with Britain, and then you end up having a one state supporting one government while another state supports a different one. So when France or Britain end up going to war, it can cause turmoil for the United States. Who are they going to support? So the countries just didn't want to mess with the United States, couldn't enforce any trade laws or any trade agreements. Each state sort of did whatever they wanted. Then we moved on to our weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation. We focused on 5. Here are the 5. National security, providing a stable economy, dealing with war debt, collecting taxes, and the authority of the central government. Those were our 5. National security. Remember, the Articles of Confederation did not give the government the power to create an army or a navy. The British still occupied forts in the Ohio River Valley and Great Lakes after the war. Providing a stable economy. Interstate commerce slowed drastically. Each state printed their own money. No one knew the value of another state's money. And one day it might be worth, it might be a pretty strong dollar, and the next day it might be a weak dollar. Dealing with war debt. Remember, each state was responsible for paying off its own war debt. The way these states raised funds or raised money to pay off the debt, they would place tariffs on taxes on other colonies' goods. Trade even slowed more after that. High-priced goods were happening. Things were too expensive. People couldn't afford it. Farmers were especially hit hard because they could not pay their own debt due to the slow trade. The banks foreclosed on their farms, so a lot of farmers were getting upset. Eventually it leads to a rebellion. It's a Shays Rebellion. But these farmers were furious. They couldn't afford to pay their debts because these tariffs, these taxes, trade was very slow. They weren't making money, so they couldn't pay for their farms. And back then, if you had debt, it was a whole different issue than we have today. They would seize your property, your home, throw you in jail until you paid it off. Collecting taxes. The central government did not have the authority to pass a tax. They couldn't pay off the war debt. They could not afford to create a navy or an army because there was no money, let alone the fact they didn't have the power to create a navy or an army. And they couldn't even provide services or national improvements. They weren't allowed to raise money to provide services. Authority of the central government's the last one. It was too difficult to pass a law. 2/3 of the people or of the states needed to vote to make a law. And then to change the Articles of Confederation, it had to be a unanimous decision. The colonists decided to get rid of the Articles of Confederation after a while. The Shays Rebellion taught them that it was messed up, the central government was too weak, they couldn't stop mobs or rebellions, so they had to create a stronger central government. But before we move on, there was one good thing about the Articles of Confederation. And remember, it was the Northwest Ordinance. And it set up our, I guess you could say, it set up 3 things, or 3 S's, if you will. It's the Northwest Ordinance. It's about how the Northwest Territory is going to be governed, and it set conditions for becoming a state, or how a territory could become a state. Now remember, there's those 3 S's: state, slavery, and settlers' rights. How a territory becomes a state, that's our state one. Remember, when they reach 5,000 and 50,000, they can do certain things to become a state. Slavery. There is no slavery in the Northwest Territory. So if you ever wonder why up here in Ohio we don't have slavery, or there's not a history of slavery, it starts right here. No slavery in the Northwest Territory. And then finally, settlers' rights. Basically, trial by jury. They were allowed to have a representative. When they came into the Union, they were going to be equal. They weren't going to be a subject of the 13 colonies. They were going to be considered a state and equal. So when they decide to get rid of the Articles of Confederation and write a constitution, there becomes 3 things that were debated, 3 hot topics: large states versus small states. Some states had a great population, a lot of people. Other states did not. For example, Virginia, they were one of the large states. They wanted the number of representatives in the legislature to be based on population, because they were larger. The more representative, or the more people they have, the more representatives they would have in the legislature. The small states were against this. They wanted to have equal representation. Okay, they didn't have as many people, so if there was equal representation, they would still retain their rights, and they wouldn't be dominated by the large states. There were 2 plans proposed. Remember, Virginia proposed a plan, 3 branches of government: executive, judicial, and legislative. Most of the plans were all right with that. But in the legislative branch, Virginia wanted to have a 2-house legislation. And again, they wanted both of those houses to be based on the population of the state. And then there was the New Jersey plan. They're a small state. They only want 1 house in the legislative branch. And they want that 1 house to be equal for all states. Now we talk about the Great Compromise. This settled this debate. The Great Compromise, also known as the Connecticut Plan or the Connecticut Compromise, was that there would be a 3-branch government: executive, judicial, and legislative. There would be 2 houses in the legislative. And then here's how they settled the problem. The House of Representatives would focus, or would allow, the number of representatives to be based on the population of the state. So the large states would have more power. The Senate said it would be equal for all states, regardless of size. So the number of representatives in the Senate was the same for all states, regardless of how big or small they are. Then there was slavery. People like Luther Martin said slavery was inconsistent with the principles of the Revolution. What he's saying is that we fought for liberty and ownership of property. Slaves don't have either of these things. So we cannot have slavery. We're hypocrites if we're going to take these things from these guys. John Rutledge, South Carolina, said if slavery was not left for each state to decide, so if the issue of slavery was not allowed to be decided by the state, he's saying the South isn't going to join. Remember, a lot of slaves in the South. That's how they farmed their plantations. So he says the South isn't even going to want to be a part of this country if you do not let the South, or let each state, handle slavery on its own. Then there was an economic argument from a Connecticut guy, Oliver Ellsworth. He says this. He says, Southern states don't want the slave trade because they can just breed slaves. They can breed them like cattle, make more slaves, and then sell them. And this Connecticut guy, I told you to think.
Just a reminder, the meeting will start at 8:10, so you may start coming down if you want. Thank you.
So this Connecticut guy says, he wants the slave trade. Remember, Connecticut, there's ports and harbors and a lot of sea trade, making ships up there. And he wants to be able to have a piece of that slave trade. He wants to be able to have the ships that go to Africa and bring the slaves back to the Americas. So he wants the slave trade to continue. Maybe he didn't really care about having slaves himself, but he wanted the slave trade to continue. And then finally, the powers of the central government. They were debated, and it ends up being this way. The national government gets the power to maintain the military, declare war, and negotiate treaties. Then the government and the states end up sharing the power. They share the power to